I've just started asking people, hey, do you know Jesus?
This is the Eternally Focused Podcast. Welcome to the EFOPOD.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the EFOPOD. I'm Michael, here with Greg. Thanks for joining us as we dive into another subject this week. Today's subject is going to be suffering. And I'm sure many of us have felt something in our lives was too much to bear at some point. Maybe like you're going through a fire, and maybe sometimes you wonder where God is in all of it. So I know that's a big subject, Greg, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge subject. I mean, and I think suffering is subjective. It depends on what's happening to you in your current life. You sent me the podcast earlier today with Johnny Erickson, Tada, and Tada. I can't say that. I want to say Tada
Right.
every time I think of her name. But she dove in as a young girl, hit a sandbar, snapped her neck and vertebra and spinal cord, and became a quadriplegic. But yet through all of that, and it wasn't just like, oh, look, now I'm a quadriplegic and I'm going to go out and be an ambassador for Christ.
Yeah.
She went through some very difficult times, but God took that incident and, he's used it for her to touch, millions of people.
Yes.
I've heard about her. This happened in 1967 when that accident happened, and I was 1 year old at the time. But through the 70s and probably even the 80s, she wrote a book. We heard about her. She's been a hero.
Yeah.
In the faith. And the things that she's doing with her charity, Johnny's House, and helping families with children with disabilities. I was in Serbia earlier this year, and they're building a Johnny's House in Opovo. So it's really outrageous how God has redeemed this terrible incident.
Yeah. No, I love her story. We shared a podcast with each other earlier just as we were kind of preparing for this topic of suffering, and was trying to wrap our heads around the question that a lot of people ask, like, God, why is this happening? Or why does God allow bad things to happen? And she was meeting with Greg Laurie, and they were just talking, kind of recanting her story a little bit, but then just also talking about the subject of suffering. And so it was really good for us just to set our minds on what we wanted to discuss today.
Well, it was really good for me because it does kind of puts things into perspective, like you said. My challenges in my daily work life that are so frustrating, and, they make me concerned about, tomorrow and what's going to happen. And, it's those seem unimportant in comparison to what Johnny's gone through. But I think we all have our challenges. And so whatever it may be that you're dealing with, I don't want to diminish that and say, oh, well, hey, you're not a quadriplegic, right? We've all got our challenges. Look, it's a fallen and broken world that we live in. It's hard to navigate. So we're all dealing with different issues, that are frustrating. And if you're not, I kind of have to question, where you are, right? Because if the evil forces are not attacking you, they're not worried about you. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think that's part of it. I think about it in spiritual realms. It's a fallen and broken world. We're dealing with corrupt people. There's all kinds of problems that happen here.
Well, and from a biblical standpoint, I think about, in John 16:33, Jesus says, in the world you'll have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And I just kind of going back to what you were saying a little bit, I find comfort in that, knowing that as a Christian that this world is fallen and broken and that there are hardships. that suffering is just a reality of the life that we live. And I do think we can find, I don't want to say, or I don't mean to say comfort, but it is encouraging to see how other people are going through life. And it kind of puts things into perspective about maybe your life isn't as tough and as bad as somebody else's. So your suffering may look a little different. And that's not to belittle your suffering. I just mean it can actually help you work through that, realizing, hey, I can do this. Somebody has it worse than I do. And not just to talk about Johnny too much longer, but she made a great point. She said, if you're really going through something in your life, one of the best things that you can do is find somebody who's going through something even harder than you. And I just thought that was a really good point because, like I said, it just helps put some things into perspective. It doesn't mean that you don't still need the community to come around you, that you need people in your life that can help build you up when you're going through difficult times. I think it just means that while you're going through it, you can also help somebody else who's going through tough things as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, she's got a great attitude. It's an attitude of gratitude. I mean, God redeemed her situation. She's impacted millions of lives. It's wonderful. I think anybody else can impact all the people around them if they see them going through challenges and struggles and troubles in life. And if they can fight through it, just keep going, just cowboy up and move on through it. You know, I mean, look, I've lost jobs. I've had financial troubles in my life. And certainly I take responsibility. I made bad decisions, but God was with me through those issues. And some of them are pretty serious. I'm not going to get into them now, but God walked through me with all of those. I came out the other side of those, and every single time it got better. Yeah. It was a better situation than what I was in before.
Were you a Christian when you were going through some of these struggles?
Well, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
I was just going to say, do you think in any of those moments, did you ever say, like, God, why am I going through this?
Yes, absolutely. But was I saved? No, I don't think so. Did I believe in God? Yes. But had I had a true experience where God intervened in my life, changed my heart, and I was doing something, I was living a different life? No.
Yeah.
But I knew about salvation, and I thought I was saved. I wasn't. I was being led around by my own sin. Yeah. And that's probably what got me into those problems. I'm saved now. Will my sin lead me into future problems? Probably. Unfortunately, I'm not sanctified. I'm not glorified. I'm being sanctified. I'm not glorified. I'm not perfect. You know, so I still make decisions that I may not be aware of that might be prideful or greedy or something like that.
Well, the reason I asked is because I was just thinking about my life and how, I don't know if you've said on the podcast before, but you said to me that I was born a Christian.
Yeah.
And so for me,
what a blessing.
I honestly, it truly is a blessing. I think there's a lot of things I avoided in life becoming a Christian at a young age that I haven't experienced that other people do experience. And I'll be honest, like there were times in my life where I was like, man, I wish I would have experienced some of those things. And looking back, I'm so glad I selfishly didn't. I think it could have been, I love seeing people who become Christians later in life because their testimony, I think, can help speak to a lot of people that are suffering in this world. And at the same time, I still think there's a lot of things in my testimony that can speak to people as well. And I used to not think that. But where I was going with it is, as far as suffering goes, I think because I've, for the most part, tried to have more of a biblical perspective on life, it's not that I've tried to minimize my suffering, but I've just realized that it's small in the big picture of eternity, in light of eternity. But I would say that maybe the conversation today might be better if we like geared it towards maybe non-Christians in particular that hopefully, you know, are tuning into this.
Well, I think and when we're talking about Johnny, I'm sorry, I just kind of jumped in.
That's okay.
And how God redeemed her life. Look, if you're having a struggle in life, all right, and you get to a point where you're so far down that you're to the end of yourself and you can't solve this problem and it becomes a desperate situation, okay, you don't have anywhere else but to turn to God. And that's probably God's purpose in this suffering, is for you to acknowledge that you are at the end of your capabilities. And I mean, look at Johnny. I mean, there was no question. She had no capabilities.
Right.
She could think, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So that's where God gets you to a point where you have to trust him. You have to say, okay, I surrender. I'm done. I don't know what else to do.
Well, and I think that's a great place to turn is in Daniel 3. It talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how that they were not willing to bend the knee to King Nebuchadnezzar. And I love the Shane song that's called or titled "Burn Us Up." And but anyway, in Daniel 3, basically,
Of course, I don't know that song.
You don't know Shane and Shane?
No.
Yeah. Well, the song is just a song about Daniel 3.
Well,
it's great.
Okay.
Yeah. But what I love about this story...
It's not on Yacht Rock. I probably haven't heard it. So,
what I love about this story is they refused to bend the knee to King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he said, well, we're going to throw them in the fire. So they literally had a fire burning. And when they went to throw them in, even I think one or two of the soldiers burned up. It was so hot.
Yeah, that's right. They turned it up. They turned this furnace up. Right. They stoked it. Yeah.
So they threw these three men in the fire. And as it was burning, they peered in and saw a fourth person walking around with them. And they weren't burned. And the fourth was an angel of the Lord.
Yeah, they brought him out and they didn't even smell like fire.
Right. And so God, in that situation, he didn't remove them from the fire, but he was with them in the fire. And I think, just to reference Johnny one more time, she said that one of her friends early on when this accident first happened to her, where she became a quadriplegic, she said this friend told her, sometimes God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. And she went on to describe, like, God doesn't love quadriplegia. He doesn't love a lot of these things. God doesn't love people burning up in fires, but he allowed these three men to be put into the fire so that he could accomplish what he loves. And what happened in that story is King Nebuchadnezzar recognized that God was the one true God. And so God used that situation to turn King Nebuchadnezzar towards him. And so when we see suffering sometimes, I think it's really neat for us to try to have perspective on it, that God's using that or can use that for his good. And we may not see it on this side of heaven, but eternity will be so sweet that it'll be worth it. At the same time, there are opportunities sometimes that God uses it and that we are lucky enough to see the outcome of that.
Well, we talked about earlier this morning, we talked about Job.
Right.
And, God allowing Satan to test Job, to torture Job. He lost his family, he had boils, his health, everything. He lost his wealth, his health, his family. And people said, well, you got to, his wife told him, why don't you just curse God and die? And he wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. And God had told Satan that he would be faithful, and Job was. I kind of think, though, in my post-salvation, my Christian life, I think there is going to be a perseverance. There's the perseverance of the saints that is not of me, that even when I'm going through troubles, I trust that God, in a feeble way, okay? So I'm not here to say, hey, Christian, you're out there going through trouble and you're not, moaning, groaning, complaining, thinking, worrying, whatever it is you're doing. I'm not saying, I know you're still trusting God, but it's hard in those moments. It's hard.
Yeah. Isaiah 43, God says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you.
Yeah.
When you go through the fire, you won't be burned.
Right. I mean, we could tell a lot of stories. I mean, we know a missionary couple whose children were here in town.
Right.
Staying with someone and the house caught on fire and their 3 children died.
Yes.
And I mean, I just cannot imagine anything. That's worse than death to me. But they're still serving. They're still preaching the word,
Mm-hmm.
And we just saw them recently. So there's millions of stories like that, that probably should be told because they have a lot of purpose for the kingdom. I just we just have to have faith. We got to trust, and we just got to keep walking through.
So, since we're Americans, there's definitely something about being an American that makes us different than some of the rest of the world, even in today's society, much less, let's say, 2,000 years ago.
Well, the suburban American problem, right? I mean, wealth and prosperity and all of those kind of things. There's a lot of people in a lot of places in this world that would be laughing at my problems.
Right. And where I was going with it was last week we mentioned reading Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount. And then just now thinking about Romans 5, where where Paul talks about that we should be rejoicing in our suffering, knowing that the suffering produces endurance and that endurance produces character and so on. That is just a foreign concept to us. I mean, in America, we don't like to suffer at all. And then we say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps or rub some dirt on it, or all these different phrases about how you can be self-sufficient, how you can do it on your own. And if you want it to be good, then you have to make it good. And not that there's not suffering in that, but this idea that suffering is not a good thing, but that it motivates you to something good, where Paul's telling us that we should be rejoicing in our suffering.
Well, I mean, in this American life, I can see where, my choices can lead me down some roads that, places I didn't need to go to. My greed, my pride. And then what's really funny about it is that on the backside of it is when I'm going through it, my worries are probably motivated by, well, what's going to happen to me if this doesn't work out the way that I need it to work out. That's another commentary on my pride. What is everybody going to think of me if I don't succeed? Right? Success is so important to us. I can't fail at this. If I do, no one will like me, or what will people think of me? And that's pride and shame. And that's also an elevation of ourselves to a godlike character, because we are going to fail. We're not perfect. And so, we've got there's a lot of introspection here on this subject for me.
Yeah.
I'm the worst of all.
Well, and I don't think we're coming at this from a place that we're trying to tell anybody anything.
I don't think we're helping anybody.
Well, I don't know. I would hope that just having the dialogue, having this discussion can be helpful. I'm not saying that we're coming at it with any therapeutic advice or anything.
No solution,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, I think the solution is Jesus. I think it's that simple. And unfortunately,
again, yeah.
Well, and unfortunately, we make it too complicated. I mean, I think the solution is very easy, and that's why I think it's so important for us to be in the Word and to be in prayer. And prayer is not, as we've talked about, it's not just like presenting your request to God, even though that's a piece of it. It's also listening for the voice of God.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this in other podcasts,
Right.
the Jamie Winship, prayers. What do you want me to know? What do you want me to do today, God? Yeah, I think that's a part of these things.
Obviously, community, as we talked about earlier as well, leaning on a faith community like we discussed with Johnny. And something for me, you just mentioned Jamie Winship, that comes to mind. Again, being in America, some of these things are so foreign to us. I think being bold in our faith, we can see that as a form of persecution, of suffering in our society. But the example that Jamie gave one time was about this young man in a Middle Eastern country who Jamie had been working with, and he was led to Christ, And he was so overcome by the Holy Spirit that he told Jamie and some other men, I'm going to go back and tell my village about this. So he heads home, and Jamie's like, I don't know that this is a good idea because it's a Muslim country. And the young man gets home and tells his community that he had accepted Jesus. And kind of what I would have expected, the community rejected him. But they didn't just reject him, they threw him off a cliff.
Yeah.
Trying to kill him. He survived. And when he was in the hospital getting better, Jamie went to visit him. And he said to Jamie, I don't think I communicated the message right.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back and tell them again.
Wow.
And Jamie said, no, you communicated it right.
Yeah, I think they got it.
And so he goes back a second time and tells the community again. And this time, his own cousin and some other men take him into a field and shoot him and leave him for dead. And the police of the bordering country find him, or the military police or something, and they pick him up and say, what happened to you? And he tells them the whole story and actually leads those men to Christ.
Yeah.
And so even through what we would consider suffering, he was faithful and led these people to Christ. God used his suffering for the good of the kingdom.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, I this is about as courageous doing this podcast with you as I get. It's been kind of an interesting week. I was at a hardware store. I don't know what's come over me lately. If someone else was with me, I think they might cringe. It might be a cringy kind of thing, but I've just started asking people, hey, do you know Jesus? This young lady, I wish I could tell you her name. I'm going to tell you her name. Her name was Deja, Deja. And I was looking for a bolt for my gate. And I said, hey, we were walking to find the bolts. And I said, hey, do you know Jesus? And she just got a sense of happiness and peace on her face. And she said, I do. And I'm so happy when someone asks me about that. And, I don't know what's come over me. This is not normal for me. And then I was like, wow, that was a really great experience. I'm going to say it to the lady at the checkout thing, and I did. And then she said, I do. And I'm getting ready to go somewhere and talk about Jesus. It was Wednesday night and she was going to a Bible study, but but as far as being bold enough to go back to my Muslim community and tell them about Jesus, I don't think so. I don't think I'm there, man. I mean, I wish I was. I hope I am. But, right now, in this day and age, it seems easier to talk about it, especially in the South where we live, but yeah, it's kind of good experiences.
Well, and I think that God uses that to kind of build in you more and more confidence to have conversations more and more going forward.
I'm going to say something pretty odd, and you may want to edit this out, but you kind of have to get used to saying the name Jesus to people. It's almost like it takes some practice, but it should become a very normal conversation, a very normal subject. Yeah. I said it to, and you're right. I actually said that to someone I work with today. I want to boldly proclaim that. I really do, because society has said, "Oh, you can't talk about that here."
Right.
You can't do that at your job.
Yeah. Separation in church and state.
Right. I could probably talk about Satan all day long. Or his emissaries, probably better so. So, yeah.
Well, and I think that's just kind of those are examples of the small types of quote unquote suffering that we go through. So Greg, I know that we're talking a lot about the idea that, suffering is temporary and that God's in control and all these things, but we may have somebody listening that hears that and is like, well, that isn't relatable to me at all. And they're thinking to themselves, I still don't understand why God allows the suffering that I'm going through. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think number one, when you are in a struggle, when you're in a challenge, like call it a work challenge, or maybe you're facing job loss, which people get laid off, whatever, and a lot of times a company closes. It doesn't really even have anything to do with anything they may have done, right?
Right.
But I think that's God's plan for your life, and He's just leading you somewhere else.
Like one door closes, another door opens.
I agree. I see my life as kind of a hallway that I'm going down. I'm traveling through this hallway, and I get kind of bumped out of one room and I go into another one, and that's the door God opened. So God's going to provide to try to soothe your feelings, emotions, when you are in the middle of that battle, of those struggles. I'm just going to tell you that I've been there. I'm 58 years of age, and God has always come up with an answer and a solution, regardless of whether it was my poor decision making that got me to this point.
Right.
I go back and I look at my life and I think about it and I say, well, I didn't make this decision when I was in school. I didn't become a doctor. I didn't become a rocket scientist. I didn't get this degree, that degree. But I go back even farther than that. And Scripture, Psalms, tells us, Psalm 139 says, God knew me, knit me together in my mother's womb. And so He knew me before I was born. He put me into the family I was born into, in the place in the world I was. And some of those things determined my decisions that I made. If I'd have been born in the poorest place in the world, would I have made good decisions about the college I was going to go to? No. So, yes, I think we share some responsibility, but God is sovereign. God has a plan. He's not surprised.
Agreed.
And He can redeem our bad decisions. So the advice, or if I don't even feel like I'm capable of giving advice, but just fall forward and trust God and surrender the issue. And I'll tell you something else that struck me this week. I heard someone talking about, and I don't remember what it was on, but the disciples were trying to cast out a demon.
Mm-hmm.
And they had cast out demons before, and they couldn't do it. And Jesus came along, and He did cast out that demon. And what Jesus said to them is, some things can't be cured or taken care of without prayer and fasting. I mean, hey, maybe tomorrow needs to be a fast day. Maybe you need to pray and fast and listen to God.
Yeah.
That may be part of the answer.
Yeah, and we talked about prayer being one of the things that can help in this situation. I mean, we talked about community being something that's important. I know in Galatians 6, it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. There's a lot of ways that you can come alongside somebody who is suffering, or if you are suffering, that you can address it. And I think prayer and fasting is great. I think that makes a lot of sense. And just know that, as Psalm 34 says, that the Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So God is with you through those. As we read that Johnny quote and other things that we've discussed, God is not far from the suffering. I mean, and then the ultimate sacrifice of all being Jesus Christ on the cross. I mean, the fact that he went to the cross, that God looked away as He's taking on the sins of the world. Mm-hmm. If we want to pretend that God doesn't recognize or understand suffering, you don't have to go any further than Jesus.
Right. And God does not want you to suffer.
Right.
And He's not going to let you suffer without a purpose to it. I think He's got a plan and a purpose, and it's to change our lives. It's part of our sanctification process.
Well, and as James says, he doesn't give us anything beyond what we can bear.
Right. Right.
So the goal isn't suffering, but he also knows that you're equipped to handle the things that are put in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, and I want people to understand that we're not diminishing their issue, their problem at the moment in time, but that there is a way out. There is a solution.
Right.
It's trust in God, give it time, and it will work its way out.
Amen. Yeah, I think the idea of prayer and fast, I think that's something that I would challenge everybody to do. I mean, I think we forget about fasting a lot, at least American Christians. I don't hear enough about it. I've heard too much about it in social settings nowadays, that like this intermittent fasting that people do.
Yeah.
But from a Christian perspective, I don't hear, and if you read the Bible, obviously the goal is not to outwardly profess that you are fasting. Don't look like you're fasting. Be joyful as you're going through it. But
it's like when I eat a salad, I'm going to tell everybody I ate a salad today. Right? Yeah.
Yes.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. You don't have to tell everybody. Yeah.
But I think that's a great place to start. And even if you don't feel like you're really going through something right now, it's still prayer and fasting. I think is, like I said, it's great for all of us to be actively doing on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today. If you're walking through a tough season and want prayer or encouragement, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear your comments, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the EFOPOD.